Good evening, everyone, and welcome to New York Buddha Dharma. We are working our way through Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, the book by Cho gyam Trungpa Rinpoche, published in about 1971, I think, right in there. And this weekend, Trungpa Rinpoche, who is a teacher, Tibetan teacher. I have never met him, but some of my good friends who are very trustworthy reporters know him well, and they say that he's a wonderful teacher, including members of the Nalanda Translation Committee. They do terrific work translating, and he has given them immense help. And he is going to be teaching at the Westchester Buddhist Center in Irvington Saturday and Sunday, but Sunday is only open to tantric practitioners. That's who he wants to talk to on Sunday. Saturday is open to anyone, pretty much. I think everybody here would be welcome. And he's going to be talking about, guess what? Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, which he regards as this book of this century. There are many people who feel that Trungpa Rinpoche was the teacher for this century. Recently, one teacher said that someone like Trungpa Rinpoche comes around once every 500 years and plants the Dharma in a very powerful way. And he certainly did in this country. And there are many teachers today who are nodding in deference to him and who have learned a lot about how to teach to Americans by following his lead. He was very, very unusual among Tibetans. For one thing, he started out doing two things that Tibetans rarely do and never really do traditionally with beginning students, and he did it with beginning students. One is that he gave pointing out instruction, and we're going to be talking about that today a bit. And the other thing is that he started us doing shamatha and vipassana meditation, which is what we just did here. And traditionally, Tibetans don't do that. They regard that as being advanced. And they regarded him as giving advanced teachings to Americans, American beginners. But he felt that it was the heart of Buddhist practice, and that Americans not only deserved it, but could do it. Tibetans, in traditional style, and many Tibetan teachers did this, would start you out with a formal practice like doing Tara practice, or they might start you out even on your nundro, doing prostrations. Formal practices where you do visualizations and not meditating on awareness and space. And so that is saved for the more advanced reaches of Tibetan Buddhism, Mahamudra and Dzogchen. And a lot of Tibetans regarded Trungpa Rinpoche as giving Mahamudra and Dzogchen meditation practices to beginners. But now there are many teachers who do this, Songsar Khyentse Rinpoche and Khandro Rinpoche and many of the other Tibetans who are following his lead. And this is why we practice as we do. So Trungpa Rinpoche is going to be speaking on Saturday on Cutting Through, which he has said he regards as the book that he said, roughly, I forget how he put it, but the gist of it is that the time calls forth the teaching. And this particular book was called forth. It was the response to these people in this time. And he called it the book for this century. And it should be studied, and then he said, and practiced. And I've also heard, I didn't see this in the quote, that he regards this as Dharma. Does everyone here know what Dharma is? I've explained it before. Revealed teaching, which is quite extraordinary, I think, to say about this book, because it certainly wasn't found or discovered in the way that normally Dharma is discovered. Trungpa Rinpoche gave a seminar and then a few more, and I was living with him, and so was another fellow named Marvin Casper. We were kind of his secretaries and his helpers, and we suggested to him that we put together a book based on these seminars. And he agreed. He'd already published Meditation in Action based on talks that he'd given in England, as well as Born in Tibet, which wasn't so much Dharma teaching as it was biography, autobiography. And he felt of Meditation in Action, he felt that it was a good book, but that it was in response to a very different audience. It was in response to an audience that was more conservative, and with whom he had to be more careful and conservative himself. Whereas with Americans, with all these hippies who were showing up, ready to try anything, and were very open and ready for the Dharma. And with them, especially in Boulder, he could be very free and give teachings in a much freer manner. He felt that he couldn't do that so much in the big cities, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, because there was so much suffering there that he felt that people were very needy and ready to take the teachings and twist it to their own purposes, their own preconceptions. But then people sort of made their way to Boulder from the coasts, and it's as though the journey somehow cleansed them of that kind of neediness to a certain degree, that kind of graspingness. And he felt that the people that he was speaking to in Boulder were very open, and he could trust them, and he was much more open with them. And so we put together the book Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, based on talks that he had given in Boulder. And it was also unique among all of his books in that we went over every word of that book with him. We took the transcripts, we edited them, and then we went to him and we said, we don't understand this part. We would read it to him, and he would give an explanation of what it was that we didn't understand, and we would rewrite it in a way that we felt was more intelligible. And then we'd take it to him and we'd say, what do you think of this? And he would say yes or no, or I think it ought to be changed this way, and he would tweak it. And we went back and forth that way over and over again on all of the material in this book. That was never done again. After Cutting Through, he trusted us for Myth of Freedom, and we didn't vet Myth of Freedom with him, nor did any of the other editors vet any of the books that followed. But Cutting Through was hammered, and in fact, it was finished. We finished the editing for that. The three of us, Marvin, Casper, myself, and Trungpa Rinpoche, went into retreat in a cabin at the mouth of the Russian River in Northern California for 3 weeks to finish the editing of Cutting Through. And we did. And we came out and gave it to a fellow had showed up to be his student, a fellow named Sam Burkholz, and another fellow named Michael Fagan. And they had a bookstore and publishing company, which they had named Shambhala, the Shambhala bookstore in Berkeley. And the publication was Shambhala Publications. And Rinpoche had signed a contract with Penguin, who had published Meditation in Action in England, and they were to get his next book, but we negotiated with them, and they let us give it to Sam Burkholz. I forget what we had to give in return. It wasn't much. They were very generous. And we gave the book to Sam, and it was published in 1971, and has had a huge impact. I can't tell you how many people I've met who said they were turned on to Tibetan Buddhism by Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what Chungling Rinpoche has to say about this, because he loves the book, evidently, feels it's seminal, and because so many people I respect who have met him think highly of him and his skills and understanding. People who are part of the Nalanda Translation Committee, like Larry Mermelstein and Mark Nowakowski and Scott Wellenbach and other people who are very skilled translators and very old dogs as Buddhists and teachers themselves. So, if you can come up, I'm taking the 8:20 train. I think he starts teaching at 10. I better check that. You can check it out. Does he? You can check it on the Westchester Buddhist Center website. And I think there's a fee of $50 per session, and there are 2 sessions in a day. So if you do the whole thing, it would cost you $100, which I think is well worth it. It's expensive, but it's because he's traveling from Asia, and this is how he foots the bill for his trip and his accommodations and all of that. So, we are on the chapter I'm cutting through called Initiation. And I'm going to cover a second chapter which you didn't read today, but which you can read for next week along with the third chapter, called Self-Deception. I felt the two go together. And first of all, a word about the word initiation. In Sanskrit, the word is abhisheka, which literally means sprinkling and pouring. And abhisheka is a ceremony that you will go through any number of times. Really, refuge vows and bodhisattva vows are an early form of abhisheka. They're not tantric. Abhisheka is always tantric. But they are a form of abhisheka nonetheless. And what it's doing is it's preparing you. It's initiating you so that you are fit to receive teachings. And I've received so many abhishekas in the course of my life, I can't remember them all. Not nearly. I should have written them down. Some people do. They keep a log of all the abhishekas they've gotten. And I don't. I've forgotten them. And a lot of them seem very ritualistic and without meaning. But what he's talking about here is the real meaning of abhisheka, which is preparing you and opening you, the student, to understand the Dharma in a deep and profound way. So, real abhisheka takes place in an intimate relationship with your spiritual friend, with a teacher. And it's magical. It's magical in the sense that both parties have to be capable of making it happen. And what it constitutes above all is opening. Opening on the part of the student and on the part of the teacher. Now the teacher, theoretically, is much more capable of opening, and has done it, in fact, in the course of their career. And by opening, I mean being precisely who they are at the moment, in the moment. This changes all the time, from moment to moment, place to place, person to person. But it has to do with extraordinary honesty. It's honesty beyond honesty. You could be honest with your teacher, and it could be a stratagem, for making things happen. It has to do with being who you are on the spot in an appropriate and responsive way to the teacher. It has to do with deep trust and friendship. It has to do with desperation, with being, giving up hope of getting something that you've imagined, and of just willing to open and be there and be who you are precisely. He says if we want something to really happen, we have to start by, 1, dealing honestly and straightforwardly with our spiritual friend. 2, making an effort to expose ourselves and our self-deceptions. And yet, you can't make a self-conscious effort to do that, because then it becomes a stratagem for getting something. And the teacher will smell the fish, the bad fish. And it has to do with surrendering and exposing the raw and rugged quality of one's ego. He called it giving the gift of ego. And it's being willing to be just who you are in response to this person. He says, it's like the teacher is like a doctor. And he said this over and over again. He loved this. Sasha, you remember. He said the teacher is going to perform an operation without anesthetics. He used to say that again and again. No anesthetics. You have to be there for the consciousness of it, for the pain, if there is pain, whatever it is. He says, finally, with the teacher, one has to just give in and let be. Our mind is overcrowded with ideas which seem so smart, so clever, so insightful, but we don't know which to choose. So at last we might really give up all these complications and just allow some space, just give in. That is the moment of real abhisheka. And I want to tell you, it doesn't happen often. You'll go through a million abhishekas that are ritualistic, with people walking around and performing little things, and they give you stuff to drink in the palm of your hand, and the teacher's reciting mantras, and you recite mantras, and it has nothing to do with this. Because we open, and we are really giving up the whole attempt to make anything happen. This is called the meeting of the two minds, the meeting of the mind of the teacher and the student. And without it, when that doesn't happen, then the student just keeps collecting, trying to collect more and more information, credentials, magic, which doesn't work, of one kind or another. He says true initiation is born out of surrender. We open ourselves to the situation as it truly is, and then we make real communication with the teacher. We have to be willing to give up our collections of credentials and present ourselves as we are and experience the teacher as he or she is. There's so many charlatans around. You can see them out there, charlatan teachers, full of ego, self-aggrandizing, collecting students, making money. It happens. And I have one in particular in my mind's eye that I'm not going to identify on video. He says, the daughters of Mara, now Mara is the tempter, and he sends his daughters to seduce us, or his sons. And they tell us that whatever it is, it's a big deal. But it isn't. It needs to be real. And then this. He says, the meeting of the two minds really takes place very naturally. Both the instructor and the student meet in a state of openness, in which they both realize that openness is the most insignificant thing in the whole world. This openness is insignificant. It's not that it's not important. No, it is that it's not important, because when you make it important, you lose it. Sasha knows this. When you make it important, then you make it a possession. Like, I'm going to hold on to it. And then it becomes my moment of openness. And it's gone. It's gone. It's like dust in your hand. This is called this moment of openness. The name for it, and he gives it in this book. He made this phrase secret later. But it's in Cutting Through, published. And so I'm going to say it. The phrase is Tamal Gishepa. And Sasha knows. It means the mind of ordinariness, or ordinary mind. Now, this is a Kagyu term. In the Nyingma scheme, they're translating the Tibetan word for neurotic mind, which is a totally different word. It's sem. And they're translating that as ordinary mind, a lot of Tibetan Nyingma teachers. But the Kagyus, when they speak of ordinary mind, they're translating tamagi shepa. And that is not neurotic mind. That is the mind of just complete presence. Simple, unadorned, no big deal. Just no comment. Just here. We all do it all the time. When we come back into the space of awareness, without thought, just clear, simple, that's ordinary mind. It's always here. It is the foundation of what we are. It's this space that is full of knowingness. In the Q&A, someone says, I can't stop trying to make it better or to secure myself, trying. His answer, you are watching yourself, watching yourself, watching. What is really needed is for you to stop caring altogether. Just come present. You have to give up the watcher and the watcher of the watcher. The intention of protection itself. And we do that every time we come fully present. You give up the watcher. The watcher is like this thing sitting on your shoulder and saying, now you're doing it. Now you're getting somewhere. Now you're not. Now you've lost it. That's what the watcher does. Makes these comments. I've been calling it skywriting because we're here in tamagi shepa, in ordinary mind. It's got lots of different names. And then thoughts come out. And thoughts say, wow, I'm in ordinary mind. Skywriting, across the sky of that open awareness. And you've lost it. And what happened to so many of us with the teacher is the teacher points this out. And you go, afterwards you're just stunned. You go, wow, that was amazing. And then you start walking around thinking, well, I've had an experience of ordinary mind. Ha 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 ha. I'm an important person. I'm moving on the spiritual path. I. And you can hear what's wrong with that. And then after a while, you start saying, well, I don't have it anymore. I want it back. And that can be a path of real suffering for some people. Closer to the mic? Sorry. So the second chapter has to do, you can hear it. It's a natural segue. The second chapter tonight is on self-deception, because that's what this is all about, self-deception. Self-deception is, at its core, is I'm a big deal because I've discovered how not to be a big deal. I've discovered ordinary mind. I've discovered awareness. I. And that is really self-deception. It's a constant problem on the spiritual path because ego, I, is always trying to achieve spiritual progress, spirituality. He said, ego wants to witness its own funeral. It wants to say, I want to get rid of ego because then I'll be a more spiritual person. I want to. He used to do this thing with us, this game that I couldn't understand for the longest time. You can't kill yourself, he used to say. It's impossible. Have I discussed this before? No? And we would say, of course you can kill yourself. You just point a gun at your head and pull the trigger, right? You're dead. And he said, no. The killer is left. The killer is still alive. And what he's talking about is this, that the I sense, you see, consciousness continues even after death. You can kill the physical body. But mind goes on. It's always now. This space of nowness. And in that space, I arises. And it says different things. And so you can kill your body, but the consciousness is going to continue with that sense of I. And now, I is a killer. I has done a terrible thing. I has killed this precious human birth. And you're floating free in a mental place, like in a dream. And it can be a very bad place. I just remember a young man, early student of Trungpa Rinpoche, must have been 1971, killed himself, took pills, and a friend of mine, Jim Lowry, who has written the book Taming Untamable Beings, went and visited Tom. And the door was open, and he walked in and saw Tom lying on a bed and thought he was taking a nap. After a while, he realized there was no movement. Went in, touched the body, and realized he was dead. Called me up. I was up at Trungpa Rinpoche's house where he and I and Marvin Casper lived. And I came down into town and went to the apartment. And sure enough, he was dead. I found out. So I called up Trungpa Rinpoche, and I was in tears. And I said, Tom O'Leary has killed himself. Rinpoche across the phone said, stop it. And instantly I stopped crying. And from then on, I took care of the arrangements. I notified the family. We called the police. The body was taken away. We never saw the body again. The family came and took it. And a day or 2, 3 later, we had a funeral service of sorts for Tom. It took place, it was winter, and it took place in a field in North Boulder. And the skies were gray. Somebody had lit a fire for warmth in an oil drum that stood in the middle of this sort of barren field. And I just remember, I've always never forgotten, the first words out of Trungpa Rinpoche's mouth as he sort of started leading this memorial for Tom, or whatever we want to call it. He said, just about now, Tom's discovering that he didn't get out of anything. Was that a shockaroo? And I've thought about that many times in my life. So suicide is not a good idea. Because then you achieve, it's the ultimate act of violence, worse than murder. It's the most heinous of all crimes. And Rinpoche explained that he said, when you commit murder, you kill one person or a group of people or whatever. But when you commit suicide, you kill the world. You reject the whole world. So it's the most heinous of all crimes, and it produces the worst karma going forward. So self-deception. Ego is a constant problem, constantly trying to achieve spirituality, wants to witness its own funeral, would like to get rid of itself. So there might be moments when you actually experience moments of egolessness, begin to see that it's a myth, a lie, not true, which is immensely incredible to realize that this story we've been telling ourselves our entire lives about I, me, is just a story. Meanwhile, there's this that we're sitting in the middle of, which is the real world. And then this little voice on your shoulder says, ooh, you're getting egolessness. I am beginning to understand egolessness. And we co-opt it again. but maybe in a subtler way. And it keeps getting subtler and subtler, that watcher, as we go along the path, and we begin to develop more and more faith in this awareness of the real world, the world of this present moment, that we can actually live in it, that we don't need the watcher. Rinpoche called him the hitchhiker, the watcher. So real initiation is beginning to get introduced to this, and it's called the meeting of the two minds. You must accept yourself as you are instead of as you would like to be, which means giving up self-deception and wishful thinking. Wishful thinking. That's a good one. Your whole makeup and personality characteristics must be recognized, accepted, and then you might find some inspiration. So your doctor works on you and you with him or her by creating a situation of open communication, which is the fundamental meaning of the meeting of the two minds. And you can do this, if you're lucky, with a great teacher, but you can do this with anyone. And it produces enormous and deep friendship when you do. This is the real way of uniting the blessings, or adhisthana, that's the word in Sanskrit. The spiritual essence of the Guru and your own spiritual essence. It's the meeting of two elements which are identical. That's the interesting thing. When this takes place, there's no feeling of superior and inferior, of higher or lower. It's a meeting of openness, of love, of friendship. And it's so simple. It's not a big deal. Ego makes it into a big deal. So now we have not only opened ourselves with the teacher, but we've experienced a flash of insight, an instant understanding of part of the teachings, and everything seems to be fine. Now we feel high for some time, varies with the person. No mundane concerns bother us, and instantaneous meditation occurs all the time. We keep coming back to awareness. It is a continuous experience of a moment of openness with the teacher. This is quite common. Some people stay in this state for weeks. But as time goes on, the experience fades and becomes just a memory the student repeats to him or herself. And at some point, something goes wrong and the memory fades. And a person can be plunged into real suffering at this point, feeling like they want to get it back. We want to capture that valuable insight experience, hold on to it, and it becomes something separate from us. And the fear of being separated from this moment of insight that we remember, keeps us separated. Because it's all about me and my fear, me and my desire to possess. And that is self-deception. We are afraid of losing it, so we do, because we lost faith in the experience of openness and wanted to own it, wanted to become something special. And then this is really the beginning of the path of wearing out ego in a real way. And we have to do it through practice and through study, the hard work. Some people have this experience and they just get the whole thing immediately. They become Buddhas. But they are few and far between. They are called instant realizers. The bulk of us tread the path. We have some understanding of openness, and we have to tread the path to developing it, to coming back to it again and again. It says ego is always looking for inspiration in the past, a possession, instead of the present, which is what we are. Self-deception depends on preferring dream to reality, dream to what is here right now. And the opposite of self-deception is just working with the facts of life. I'm going to read this whole section here that I thought was so powerful. This is the whole point. A fear of separation. And this is true for anybody, whether they've had this pointing out instruction or not. A fear of separation, the fear of loneliness, the fear of despair, the fear of hopelessness, of disappointment, vast disappointment. A fear of separation, the hope of attaining union, these are not just manifestations of or the actions of ego or self-deception, as if ego were somehow a real thing which performed certain actions, complained, had insights, did whatever. Ego is the actions. Ego is these mental events of having, of treasuring this insight, wanting it back again, complaining that you don't have it. That is ego. That's what ego does. Stop doing that and ego's gone. Ego is the fear of losing openness, the fear of losing the egoless state. This is the meaning of self-deception. In this case, ego crying that it has lost the egoless state, its dream of attainment. Fear, hope, loss, gain, these are the ongoing action of the dream of ego. So when you're caught up in fear, hope, dream, a dream of attainment, self-praise, this is all ego. All I. And it's just this voice that takes place and then is gone. And here we are back again, right here. This is the real world. So the real experience beyond the dream world is the beauty and color and excitement of the real experience of now in everyday life. And this is going to become so important in this book and in these teachings. I'll read it again. So the real experience beyond the dream world is the beauty and color and excitement of the real experience of now in everyday life. This is Tantra. This is the stuff of enlightenment. When we face things as they are, we give up the hope of something better. There will be no magic because we cannot tell ourselves to get out of our depression. Depression and ignorance, the emotions, whatever we experience, are all real and contain tremendous truth. If we really want to learn and see the experience of truth, we have to be where we are. And someone says, how do you get out of spiritual materialism? Of evaluating, cherishing, and being proud of your experiences on the path? Rinpoche responds, once you realize that you are actually doing this and are not getting anything from it, then I think you begin to find your way out, especially if you're practicing, coming back to the present. There is no magic or trick involved. The only thing to do is to quite painfully unmask by coming back. Then you might learn a very useful lesson, to give up the whole thing, to be nothing. You might even experience a yearning to be nothing. We need to give up the ambition to be better, more spiritual. One has to give in, surrender, which is what we do every time we come back to the present in our meditation practice. If we eliminate the filter of I and other, then the space becomes sharp and precise and intelligent and colorful and vivid and meaningful. One does not really need the watcher or the observer at all. And that colorfulness, you see, and that meaningfulness and that vividness is what is revealed when we begin to stop thinking so much. And this is the entrance into Tantra. Shunyata is this clarity. And then finally he says about removing the watcher. You do not have to regard the watcher as a villain. Once you begin to understand the purpose of meditation is not to get higher, but to be present here, then it automatically falls away, the watcher. Total awareness is something you already have. So ambitious or so-called efficient attempts to be aware are self-defeating. If you try to be aware, you're trying to be what you already are. So it gets in the way. Boy, some people looking. This was not a cheerful chapter, was it? You think? So we could have a discussion. There's a mic over there, Tim.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that,
Ben.
I mean, that last thing you said is...
The last what?
The last thing that you said is, very cheerful, or very optimistic, really, that you already have everything that you think you need, and that you already are awareness itself in a very fundamental way.
Yes.
And that's the best thing you could know.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ben. This is the teaching of Buddha nature, that it already is there inside us, or bodhicitta, awakened mind. It's all there. It's just waiting to be revealed in more and more powerfully. We all touch in on it from time to time. And that's what's happening when a person experiences Tamalakishepa, ordinary mind. They're touching in on their Buddha nature. Their bodhicitta. Bodhi means awake. Chitta is mind. Yeah. Now this is very powerful teaching. So when we meditate, we just come back again and again and relax into awareness in the present moment. And if we need the breath to sort of anchor us, to bring us back out of dream, that's fine. You go out and you go out with the breath, and as the breath dissolves, you let go. Rinpoche called it gap. And in that moment of gap, you can really be present here in a very powerful way. Thanks. I seem to have stifled conversation. Joe.
Did you say something about depression in the reading when you were reading that page? What was it that you said? That the writings say?
On the one hand, we have to stop trying to achieve a kind of false kind of gaiety or happiness. And it's important to embrace disappointment in one's life. By embrace it, I don't mean that you're rolling around in it, but one stops trying to get away from it by going to movies, by bucking oneself up, by drinking or taking drugs or having lots of sex or whatever it is that we might do to try and distract ourselves from our disappointment. And instead, we come back to this life as it truly is. And if it's disappointing, that's an extra add-on. That's a thought. And we begin to realize that, when you have that kind of depression and disappointment, one is rolling around in a bunch of negative thoughts. And you can treat those as thinking, and you just say thinking to them, and you come back to awareness in the present moment. And you begin to realize that they are just another version of ego.
I was just going to say in a way that's hard to connect with. Kind of contradicts about depression being ego and I.
It is. You're right. Yeah. Thank you. That's great. It is. But if you try and sort of, medicate yourself in one way or another out of depression, that's a bad way to go. I don't mean literally medicate, but there are ways you can, talk yourself out of it. And people spend a lot of time trying to avoid depression, going to museums, going to Europe, going to the beach, making love, if you use those things, which are fine activities in themselves, but if one uses them as an escape, a way of trying to distract oneself from depression, it's not so good. Whatever it might be. And it can be substance abuse. Tricky wicket. Sticky wicket. Tim.
Just two thoughts. First of all, for disappointment to exist, there must have been an expectation in the first place that was not fulfilled. So the whole thing is a construct. But to the point of skillful means, saying to someone who's suffering from depression, don't worry about it, it's all in your head, is not skillful. Because for them, it's very real, and they need to find their own way out of it. It can't be beaten out of them with a stick, so to speak, metaphorical or physical.
Well said. Well said. Sometimes it's necessary for people to take drugs, antidepressants. Absolutely. Yes, Carmen.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for talking about the process of the making of the book. It's just always wonderful to hear all the stories. Plus, it seems like it is reflected that every word that is written there is so sharp and full of meaning. Every sentence seems so carefully put and just, again, full of meaning. So I'm not surprised for what you shared today. It's incredible work. Thank you so much. Once again, I think it strikes me that the word surrender, is said over and over and over again so far in every single chapter as a very important point. It seems like since everything is there and everything has been accomplished, there's nothing but for that stubborn story or idea where we have just to let go into that ordinary mind that you were talking about. So surrendering seems to be a fine thread so far within these chapters.
Yeah. And, he was talking about himself and his relationship to his students at that time. And people were coming for the first time to meet him. And on the whole, people made a huge connection with him because he was so genuine himself that he inspired that in the person sitting in front of him. At the same time, there were some people, though, who couldn't let down their masks. And with those kind of people, he was shut off. He would be less communicative and less open himself. But he loved it when people sat down and opened to him and showed him their minds and their hearts, and he would do the same. And he talked about this as what it really meant to be a meditation teacher, was to open that way, to share that openness with a student, to show it to the student, to create, help the student into it by opening himself. Some people couldn't respond to it, though, occasionally. And he felt that by the time people got from the coasts to Boulder, they were more ready. That book, wonderful book that Jim Lowry wrote, Taming Untamable Beings. It's about the pygmies. What happened was that, Boulder, there were communes all around Boulder. They're all gone today, pretty much. but there were lots of communes back then. It was 1970, 71. And counterculture was in full swing. Hippies. And I remember there was a commune up on the Peak to Peak Highway. What were they called? The Brainerd Lake commune. And they were all Marxists, sort of harsh, And there was one down in southern Colorado, the Red Rockers. And they were all LA studio musicians, wealthy. And there was one down in northern New Mexico, the guy who invented Zomes. Zomes were this guy, you remember Buckminster Fuller and geodesic domes? This guy made geodesic domes out of smashed car bodies, and he called them Zomes. And there was this whole commune that started down there around his Zomes. And then there were a bunch of others. But the Pygmies were a bunch of people. They lived out east of town on Arapahoe Avenue. And some of them were short, hence the name Pygmies. And a lot of them had come from New Orleans, where they had been together. And they had met a voodoo woman who taught voodoo. And she'd given them names, which they used. So Don Winchell was known as Ragatara. Oh, God, Don, forgive me. You see this video. And there was Nikki Sabroka was Zalia. And Rick Kemp was Mao. And Sarah Kemp was Nerty. And on, these names. And they lived out on East Arapahoe. And when they showed up, they became, they came to his talks. And then they came for interviews. And he fell in love with them. They were open, so open. They were ready. And not only were they open, but they were generous. They were sweet. They didn't have any money, and they were just gave everything. I mean, we didn't have a car. Marvin, I, and Trungpa Rinpoche. Some people had lent us their VW Bug, and we needed to give it back. So the Pygmies gave us their car. It was a bright yellow, ancient Carmen Ghia. They just gave it, and they were like that. And they didn't have any money at all. They made their living making leather clothes, like cowboy clothes with big fringes like this, and dressing in them themselves. And they all had beards and long hair. And they also made pipes out of deer antler, what kind of pipes. And also these big knives with deer antler handles. And they would sell these things. And that's the way they got their living. And so he fell in love with the Pygmies. And there's a very extraordinary chapter in that book where Jim has gotten several of the Pygmies, a number of the Pygmies, to describe their pointing out experience with Trungpa Rinpoche. And it's interesting to read that chapter, to say the least. And I just remember, people would come for interviews. We would schedule interviews. And they would show up, and my job was to show them in. And Rinpoche, we didn't have any money, so we had gone to the Salvation Army, and we bought these really cheap blue and white ticking mattresses, and we had them on the floor, about that thick, And then a woman, a student of Rinpoche's, named Judith Hurley, had tie-dyed a bunch of sheets in Tibetan colors, bright yellow and orange. And she gave us these sheets. So we covered these mattresses with these sheets. And Rinpoche would be sitting there on one of these mattresses, and we'd show these people. And I remember I showed in maybe some Pygmies. 4 guys show up. And they're all dressed in leather, beards down to here, hair down to there, right? And they come in and they sit down at the end of the bed. And one of them says to Rinpoche, just about like this, never forgotten it. Rinpoche, we're bodhisattvas, and we live on East Arapahoe. He loved them. He loved them. The connection was intense and immediate. They all became his students. I think all of them, one way or another. There are lots of stories about them, including stories about Jim Lowry, which he didn't. I don't know if he told it. I don't think he told it in that book. That at one point, early on, before Rinpoche came, Jim had decided, he'd read about the Tibetan practice of raising dumo. Anybody here ever heard of that? Dumo means inner heat. It's a yogic practice, advanced. And you do this practice and you can raise heat in your body. And when a person is accomplished, it's part of the practice of Mahamudra. It's one of the yogas. It's the first one, actually. And when a person has accomplished Dumo, it was traditional they'd give him a test. And the test was that they would take him out in the middle of winter and wrap him in a sheet that was wet. And he would walk around the monastery and dry the sheet, okay, with the heat that he was generating from his body. So Jim was living out, they were living out on East Arapaho in this tract house, and Jim had a teepee. And he told them all that he was practicing Dumo in his teepee, and that he had accomplished it. So they decided to give him the test. And they did that to him. They wrapped him in a wet sheet, and he got sick in the middle of winter. We're trying to walk around the house out there. There are lots of other stories about the pygmies, endless. Zanto, he was a good friend of mine. He died recently. He was one of them. Zanto had been in the 101st Airborne, most combat-ready division of the American military. And tattoos. Talk like this, Johnny. He'd say, Johnny, how are you, Johnny? And we both had motorcycles later on and rode together. And he became a very, very good practitioner. And he married a girl, and he put her through law school by being a hairdresser. Now this guy was completely bald. He looked like something out of the Grateful Dead. Long gray hair down to here, right? And a beard, scraggly beard, like down here, and gray and black. And he was a hairdresser in Boulder. And he put her through law school, and then they divorced. And anyhow, he was a wonderful, sweet guy. I'm telling stories. Should I tell one more story? When we got what is now Shambhala Mountain Center, the land, up in Fort Collins, the pygmies had been waiting, and there's a whole story behind that. And they'd been camped out up in Somerville, waiting for the land. And we got the land on September 17th. And 16th, I think, we took possession. On the 17th, they were ready, poised to go up and start putting residences up. And it dropped 4 feet of snow on that land, 4 feet. They went up, cleared out the snow, and built little A-frames, on the dirt, with and tacked up insulation. And they spent the winter up there. And they were doing lots of drugs. The pygmies did a ton of drugs. I never saw so much psychedelics consumed by individuals. I mean, beyond belief, the amount of psychedelics that one person could ingest. And Marvin and I, we'd go up there, and everybody's smoking dope and, taking LSD and every other damn thing. And we got worried, because this is redneck country. People are riding around in pickups with, Winchester rifles in the back window, that kind of stuff. And we figured, gee, if they wanted to get rid of us, this raggedy bunch of hippies living on this, it was 360 acres originally, and then we got some more money and added on. All they have to do is call in the cops to bust them. So Marvin and I went to Rinpoche, and we told him about this danger. He wrote a letter to the pygmies and everybody, and a few other people who were living with them. And he said he wanted them to stop doing drugs, that it was self-deception. Right? Now, meanwhile, you have to understand that when Rinpoche, the teachings he'd been giving us, he hadn't given us any tantra, no exotic practices. We would just sit, and he talked about the kind of things you're reading here, in this book. And he used to say to people, don't go on any trips. Please don't go on any trips, like trying to change yourself. And I remember him saying to everybody, looking out at us and saying, if I told you to stand on your head 24 hours a day, you'd do it. because everybody was so naive and gullible and ready to buy anything, right? So he used to tell us, don't go on any trips. So when we wrote this letter telling him to stop doing drugs, that it wasn't, part of the Dharma and all that, they thought he was kidding. Or they wanted to think he was kidding. And, because he'd been sending up this message of don't go on any trips, and now he's telling him stop doing drugs. Well, drugs was what they'd been doing for years. So they kept right on doing them. And we couldn't get him to stop. I remember going up there for Thanksgiving, and everybody was stoned. So Rinpoche called a meeting down in the house at 4 Mile Canyon, the house that he and I and Marvin and Diana lived in. Diana was away in England. He and Diana lived, it was a duplex, and each floor was the mirror of the other. And so upstairs we had, just like downstairs, and we had this living room with a stone fireplace with a ledge that you could sit on, just like I'm sitting on this chair, around the fireplace. And we invited, it was middle of winter, and we told all the pygmies to come down, and everybody up at what was now called Rocky Mountain Dharma Center. And he told them, bring your drugs. So they think, partay, They all showed up with their drugs. And they camped, this is like 30 people at least, with babies, some of them, in the living room, upstairs, wall to wall, unwashed, living. There was no running water up there. It was really a scene. Babies and solid hippies, wall to wall. So we have this meeting. And Rinpoche announces, he has me build a fire in the fireplace. And he's sitting by the fireplace. And he announces that he wants them all to come up and give him their drugs. And we're going to throw them in the fire, and we are burning self-deception. That's what he says we're going to do. Burning self-deception. So one by one, they come up, and they hand him these drugs, and he throws the drugs into this flaming, this big fire that he'd had me build in the fireplace. But I remember Zonto, this guy from the 101st Airborne, the hair, the Grateful Dead. He comes up, and the room is packed, right? It's not like you could whisper. And he whispers to Rinpoche. Everybody could hear it. He says, and I'm sitting right next to Rinpoche, so I could hear it. And he says, Rinpoche, this is really good hash. Don't burn it, and you and I can smoke it later. And he's whispering this. Everybody can hear. And Rinpoche takes it, and he says, no, we're burning self-deception. And he throws it into the fireplace. And so after that, more or less drug-free up there. More or less. So that's enough stories. I'm sorry I'm rambling. But it's relevant. He was burning self-deception. That you could get high and call it some kind of dharma. But it was just drugs. Okay, we should end. So we'll say the dedication of merit. And I recommend Jim's book. It's fun about the pygmies. Huh? Taming Untamable Beings. It's from a chant. By this merit, may all attain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory. That's a Shambhala vow. Okay.